So this is week 82 of the weekly discussions, and we're talking about John Wesley and money this week. Effective altruism is two things. It's this idea, and it's a community focused on using evidence and careful reasoning to figure out the very best ways to do good in the world, and then to act on that basis. We are the Christian group within effective altruism, so we come at it from this shared faith in Christian perspective. So today we're talking about John Wesley. And who was John Wesley? Well, he was actually an Anglican theologian in the 1700s. He's from Britain, and he was part of a revivalist movement in this time. There are a lot of, you might remember the Great Awakening. He's one of the Great Awakening preachers. He even spent quite a lot of time in the US. He produced a new strand or movement within Christianity that we now know of as Methodism, but his writings and his work during his life were very influential, and he impacted quite a lot of people. He traveled widely. He was generally on horseback, preaching several times a day. Stephen Tompkins, a historian, writes that he rode 250,000 miles. I did the math. That's something like 17 miles every day for 40 years. He gave away 30,000 pounds, which is an exorbitant amount in his day. And he preached more than 40,000 sermons, which, yeah, if you do the math, that's like 3 sermons a day for 40 years or something insane. Needless to say, he affected a lot of people. By his death, there were 135,000 people who were officially members under the name of Methodist, and hundreds of itinerant preachers who he would set up in an area after he was preaching. He basically continued his work, his legacy through local preachers, itinerant preachers who would continue to disciple and mentor people. But at the end of Wesley's life, he was actually afraid about the future of the church and the future of the Methodists, as people were calling themselves, people who were influenced by his ministry. And he said, I'm not afraid that Methodists would cease to exist in Europe or America. He said, I am afraid lest they should only exist as a dead sect, having the form of religion without the power. And this undoubtedly will be the case unless they hold fast both to the doctrine, spirit, and discipline with which they first set out. But what was it exactly about the doctrine, the spirit, and the discipline of the Methodists and of the church at large that Wesley was afraid of? Actually, if you check the United Methodist Church's website and you read what scholars write from his writings here, they say that the number one concern he had was actually concern about the love of money. In fact, the website states that Wesley considered wealth and the failure to give the most serious threat to the Methodist movement, in particular, in Christianity in general. So why did Wesley think that the love of money was so destructive? Well, it really gets at the core of someone's spiritual life. Wesley thought that love of money leads to less love for God. It leads to a lack of desire in sanctification, and that kind of gritty seeking for perfection that you see in people who are new to the faith, who have this energy to grow in their spiritual life. The more material blessings people get, the less this fire seems to glow in their hearts. And Wesley certainly saw that. He also saw that love of money produces some kind of pride, that people who developed more, who had much more money, who rose in status and ranks among other people, that they saw themselves as being better. Here's a good quote from this, where he's kind of ridiculing these people who've increased their wealth. You once pushed on through cold or rain or whatever cross lay in your way to see the poor, the sick, the distressed. Now, however, he asks, do you fear spoiling your silken coat? Are you afraid of catching vermin? So yes, I wonder what the modern equivalent of this would be. Like, I remember the other day, I was concerned about my AirPod falling out of my ear after the gym, and oftentimes that's like much more a concern to me than like the person in need that I pass by on the street on my way home from the gym. So I think there is this kind of pride here that seeps in. There's also this personal neglect of evangelism, where when we just get wealth and riches, we neglect our Great Commission to share the love of Jesus with other people, which is not just sharing in word, but also in deed. So how did Wesley get to this point? He was certainly a bit of an exception in his time about talking about money. And I want to share just real quick, like his conversion regarding his views on money. And he tells a story of how he splashed out some money on some paintings for an apartment he was living in at the time. This was in the dead of winter. And as he sat in his cozy apartment admiring his paintings, he heard a knock on the door. And he went to the door and he saw a chambermaid who was poor, who begged him for money. And he actually didn't have any more because he'd splashed it out on the paintings. And so he just sent her away empty. And he just felt convicted with guilt and thought, oh my gosh, like are not these pictures the blood of this poor maid? Have not my expenditures led to the suffering of this maid? And so that was a turning point for Wesley, and began to preach about money all his life, especially at the end of his life, his last few years of life. He became even more ardent about this, and even more frustrated. Like if you read what he was writing, he talks with frustration about how few preachers are preaching about this, and also how few of his followers are putting this into practice. He gives this admonishment to do three things: to gain all that you can, to save all that you can, and then give all that you can. And he remarks that you find a lot of people who observe the first. A lot of people are trying to get as much money as they can. You find a few people that observe the second, a few people who save. And then he says, but how many have you found that observe the third rule? Give all you can. Have you reason to believe that 500 of these are to be found among 50,000 Methodists? And yet nothing could be more plain than that. All who observe the first rule without the third, the first two rules without the third, will be twofold more the children of hell than ever they were before. These are really harsh words. And I think it holds true today in many sense. Here's just another quote of Wesley about the use of money. I won't go through this, but Wesley really saw money as just a means to an end. It's a means to which we provide food for the hungry, drink for the thirsty, and a father for the fatherless, and so forth. So what could he teach Christian EAs today? I think some of the message is like very familiar. We know this. I think many of us have heard this mantra before: gain all you can, save all you can, give all you can. But I think Wesley could also teach us that giving is rooted in God's very being, that God is a God who gives in self-giving love, that God is a God who created the world out of his abundance, and a God who also gave himself, especially in Jesus. And that this is just the kind of nature we see in God. And so when we give, we are not just helping others, but we're participating in the life of God, by analogy, right? Giving also includes more than just money. John Wesley talks about this, although we often talk about, in EA, we talk about giving our time, right? And giving our career to do good for others. One thing I think we can learn from Wesley is that giving also involves friendship with the poor. I think that's difficult for me, especially when I'm very comfortable just like giving X% to this GiveWell charity, but not actually making friends with people who are hard for me sometimes to be friends with, and seeing everybody as someone who God loves, not just in an abstract way, but in a real way, in a way that is experienced in my life. I think that's something that I struggle with as someone in the EA movement. I think there might be others who might struggle with this as well. So I'd like to just talk about how we can grow in that. But also giving involves not just individual charity, but also building communities. Wesley was a person who didn't just give to individual causes, but also tried to promote communities that would sustain themselves and do good for many generations rather than one-off solutions. So there's maybe like a systemic kind of improvement that we see here. And then finally, giving should help people's bodies and their souls. I don't know if we can draw a hard, fast distinction between the body and the soul, but Wesley certainly believed in hell, and he certainly believed in eternal significance and in what happens to people after they die. And I think Christians in EA, we can take these ideas seriously and think not just about how do we feed people now, but how do we give them life and eternal, and like a really full life that will just begin now and continue into the next. So some questions for discussion. Where are the Wesleys in today's church? Where are the pastors who are preaching these sermons about money in really challenging, bold ways? And then if Wesley were alive today, would he be in EA? Like, would he be in this movement? What would scare him off from this movement? And then finally, what else in Wesley's writing challenges you? And I'd love to share how we feel challenged, and then also maybe encourage each other for ways that we can grow to put this in practice in our lives.